Usually, we talk with just one person who's made a significant contribution to the systemic field, but in this podcast, we're doing something different. We've invited 3 systemic therapists, Gill Goodwillie, Gorney and Gwyn Whitfield, to talk with each other about their involvement in community work in the 1970s and 80s in the UK. And we're interested to hear how this went on to influence their practice as systemic therapists. For those of you who don't know, the 1970s and 80s, under various governments and Labour councils in the UK, saw a shift in the balance of local representation, and this resulted in the needs of different communities being taken more seriously. Councillors themselves came from a variety of backgrounds and could attest to those communities who were under pressure already having the talent, the skills, the knowledge and determination to create the resources they needed for their communities to thrive and grow, where they offered additional support financially and materially. Community projects grew up across many towns and cities and rural areas of the UK, and the job of community workers was to work alongside community members to support locally led cultural practices and to create with them the resources, the people, power, and the opportunities to trust existing know-how and grow new skills and campaigning and resources. I'm going to hand over to Gill, Carrie and Gwyn to tell you more about their experience and how the ethos of those community projects that they worked in influenced their practice and values as systemic therapists. Over to you guys.
People telling such a different story about their workplace that it was difficult to understand or connect with it. And were you meaning, Gwyn, people who were working with local authority or big systems or like the NHS or was a very different, had a very different perspective to those of us who worked in voluntary organisations?
Yeah, in some ways, because I suppose I was thinking at KCC, a lot of people there, obviously was more systemically in tuned in a way, but were, for instance, having funding through being social workers and so forth.
Yes.
And working in more statutory settings by that stage. So, and also by then I was working in the practice, so I was doing much more work in the queer community. And that was quite difficult for people to get comfortable with. I don't think I realised it as much at the time. Made more sense later. But I think, I don't know, it was interesting when I was doing my chronology. I was thinking I started off, ironically, being employed or being paid by social services to do work on 2 estates in Edinburgh, using a bus to provide facilities for parents and preschool children. And there is a real irony to it, because the reason I was employed was because the woman who had that job in social services was completely, she was an artist, and she was completely off the radar of anything social service would ever really have elected for. But she kind of got a lot of things that were very out of the box. And so I think she just liked me when I turned up. She just thought I was probably someone she was right. I had a naivety and a certain kind of enthusiasm and so forth. And she thought, yeah, let's give it a go. And I was willing to learn to drive a big bus. And so, she said, yeah, let's do it. And she was great. And actually, it was definitely it was something that wasn't happening, and there were no resources for largely women, but for parents and preschool children. And so it was an opportunity both to bring resources on site to estates,
sure,
but also it created an opportunity to parents to kind of get together in a way through the children and so forth, and to do lots of kind of because often they were people who hadn't had any kind of play or that sort of input themselves. So it's for them to see themselves as participating as educators in their children's development and so forth. It was really, you know, it was a nice, and I felt really, because when I first came to this country, I was in Essex for a year, and I found it quite hard culturally. When I went to Scotland, I felt I was being welcomed in a whole different way, and the culture just felt so much warmer, and, you know, I kind of felt I got it and they got something about me. There are lots of tricky things about it. You know, we had kids whose parents complained that their little boy wanted to dress up in girls' clothing. But, you know, they were opportunities in a way. So ironically, my start in this country in many ways was the only time I've ever been employed effectively or paid by an institution. But the brief was not one that was formulated. It was one that was allowed to formulate as we went along.
Can I just pick you up on there's something that I think is really important in your description of working on estates, and being able to parents, mums, and kids being able to access you easily, and I think that was a kind of baseline for the route that I took, because I became very early on, actually, when I was connected with theatre, with feeling very angry about the importance on buildings, and the nicer the building, the better, and all the fundraising would go towards getting the building. And I worked in Milton Keynes in the 70s, and we were given the building, but it was isolated by roads, by motorways, as the new city was being built. And you had to cross these motorways from the housing estates to get to the buildings. So I did the same thing that we'd done years earlier, which is to pack a cart full of goodies and take them out to the estates, and to work on the estates with people, probably doing very similar work to you, Gwyn, at that time. But what I noticed, and that hasn't changed for me, the emphasis on, it's again the emphasis on materialism, and the thing that shows what you do, rather than in the relationship between people, and I think that's been a major theme for me right through my working life, is to actually get out of the building and get to on people's home territory where they feel comfortable. And in fact, you know, at the end of my career, I was working in CAMS in Brent, in Sheffield, and then in Brent, and wherever possible, we went into people's houses and worked with people at home, rather than asking them to come to the building and keep them waiting in the waiting room, and everything that went with that. And I just wondered what both your experiences were of building-based and not building-based.
Well, I would say, like Gwyn, my first experiences were working in a very deprived sink estate outside Stirling in Alloa called the Bow House. And in the Bow House, you couldn't get a library ticket if you had an address in the Bow House. It was a community of marginalised, high proportion of mental health issues, and my job was to actually set up a play scheme, so that as I was on placement with this community worker, and absolutely the idea of a community, I think for me the connection then with systemic ideas and thinking is actually working with a community to recognise its own resources. And this actually was the first tenants organisation to take a local authority to court under public health. The conditions were absolutely unsanitary. Sewage flowed into the backs of this estate. Parents had such levels of dampness in the house, and of course there was nowhere to play that was safe. So I would connect with
with both of you around actually the ideas around working with children, working with parents, and actually enabling or supporting groups to identify strengths and actually challenge the system.
I think the on-site thing is interesting. And I agree, Jill. I think the thing about and this does connect, I think, with systemic practice, that actually my experience when I came into the idea of community-based work, and I think it probably is even more so now, if such things even exist, is the idea that somehow you're providing something that doesn't exist in communities and in localities. But actually, I think that's kind of part of the problem, is that actually there are systems that work. There are sometimes not systems that are resourced, but there are systems that are doing jobs, and they're doing them much better often. And it's how to put resources into that, the acknowledgement and the development of those systems, rather than the replacement and the imposition of the latest ridiculous model that's been imported by the health service at great cost from somewhere else and turned into a formula. So I do think there's something about recognizing what, just like with clients, recognizing with them what are the resources they have and how to, harness them and work together with those.
I was going to say, it's interesting, the idea. I mean, I suppose I find myself reacting to and hearing Carrie also worked in CAMHS. It's that idea. I always felt that I was an internal challenge in working in CAMHS. And I only went to the NHS after many years of working in the voluntary sector, particularly working with children with disabilities and adventure play. And that idea about resourcing and how you get resources is absolutely crucial for anyone in the voluntary sector.
If we take some steps back, thinking about what you're saying about how resources are disseminated, one of the things back then was when you went out to the estate, you went on to the territory of the people with whom you were working. And they were actually the most important resource you could have. So that, for example, when we run play schemes, it was getting mainly the mums on the play scheme, on the estate, to run the play scheme with you. It wasn't importing expert and specialist people. It was using local resources and building up local skills. And one of the conflicts that I've had, fast forward, I don't know, 50 years or something, one of the problems I felt always in CAMHS was this kind of persona of being a professional. And it's an irony, because I think I chose to train in systemic therapy because I didn't know what to call myself. By the time I was in my 30s or 40s, I was still kind of muttering, well, maybe I'm a play leader. And I wanted to, in terms of the outside world, I wanted to define who I was, and I wanted to nail what I knew and expand that knowledge. But the price I paid for that was when I came out of KCC with my diploma and got jobs in CAMHS, or I was suddenly a mental health professional. And it's like, be careful for what you wish for, because it's I felt very uncomfortable with that. I continued always to want to work from the bottom up. But once you got into a system like the health system, you were working from the top, or colleagues were reaching for the top, and you were working down. And it immediately diluted what you could be doing. Or, I mean, that gets into a description of therapy as opposed to community work, doesn't it? Or when, or what was, how did we all see the transition from being community involved and maybe quite socially and politically involved to being a therapist? And how do you see that?
I mean, I think when I was thinking about my chronology, I was thinking about how my ideological commitments were very much part of my work, like at the bus company, you know, obviously when at the bus company with Carrie was at Interaction, Jill.
Right, okay.
The bus
I
company
remember
was
Interaction.
what evolved from Interaction, so we kind of have some overlap there. But of course, you know, the bus company collective, people had particular areas of responsibility, but everyone did everything. And there, for instance, the on-siteness was an opportunity for people who were organising locally to come across one another, as well as to use the resources we had located there. So it did various things. But when I was looking at the chronology of stuff, I was thinking, I realised after I'd been at family service units, which was somewhere else, Carrie was in Harlesden, where I was employed specifically to do a project working what was then known as Home Start and was only being done in Leicester. It's now become a big national scheme, Sure Start. And I was employed then. When I went to that FSU, it was doing good social work. In fact, some of the early family therapy was being done there, but it was very individualizing in a way. It didn't see people in the context of community and belonging. And it was an all-white staff team, and it was almost predominantly an Afro-Caribbean community. And I just could not get that brief off the ground in my mind because it was so individualized and so out of context. So we developed more of a community-based house that people could come to, and we did things that were supportive, if you like, to parents and children in the community, but not about that kind of one person goes to one person's house and that. Yeah. And that did a lot of different things. It did, for instance, it was able to identify within the community who was at risk, what children were at risk, what women were at risk of mental health stuff, where there was domestic violence, and it had a different response to it. It wasn't about having to make statutory responses and social services getting involved. That would not have helped. Often it compounded things. So it was something that was, you know, very important. But when I thought that I realized soon after I went to at FSU, I realized that I had to do something because times were changing. I had to do something to develop my therapeutic interest more. And so I thought I'm going to find a training. And thank goodness I came across KCC because I'd done some stuff that was sort of more psychodynamic, and it just felt dead in the water for me. When I went to KCC, of course, Peter Lang and I had some shared background, and I liked him, and I didn't have a previous social work qualification, etc. But like Norma Clark at Social Services, he thought, yeah, let's give it a go. And at that time, while I was training there, I was working at Family Welfare Association in East Ham. And that was just like, because of the stories about therapy, it was so depressing. It was back to this atomized story of individual pathology. Everyone was being referred from psychiatric settings. You'd spend the referral meetings with everyone having these, you know, comorbidity, all of this sort of the language of pathology. And it was terrible because they were working sometimes with, you know, groups of Asian women, had a lot of domestic violence to cope with, not just because they were Asian, but there were a lot of issues, and there was no real capacity to respond to it in a more systemic way.
Sure.
I saw it out because I needed to have hours and therapy. But actually, it was great because once I qualified, Gail and I, just before I qualified, we set up the pink practice so that I didn't have to face some of the things, Carrie, you're talking about, which is, first of all, trying to find myself a job at CAMS. I wouldn't have wanted it, but I really don't think they would have employed me. I didn't have the right CV. And of course, it was perfect for me because it was about being from within a community, not coming from a place of orthodoxies,
Sure.
creating notions, well, creating what it meant to be gay through the therapy process and creating what it meant to be a therapist, not about receiving a lot of pathology, which many training courses still do and still have done, around, therapy trainings. Have you ever had penetrative sex? Those were the kinds of questions people used to get asked if they outed themselves as gay when going for training courses. So it's been much more about creating recognizing resources within people, within the wide, and we've done it through various things, wider system questionings, the sort of thing Gail developed in the practice where people are not being invited to other themselves, which definitely had been the case in therapy that was available to the gay community then, but people seeing themselves as part of a community of experience. Mm-hmm. We did other things. We used to have a whiteboard in our consulting room in London, and sometimes people could, if they wanted to, write something down on the whiteboard that had come from their therapy that day for others to see if they wanted to. So they're trying to break down that idea of those walls, that therapy is very discreet.
Sure.
So, I do think there's something very important about context, and systemic work is very much about context. And I think when constructionism came along originally, which happened to coincide with when I was training at KCC and started in 89, it just helped make sense of things to do with power and discourse and so forth in a way that nothing else was doing from a theoretical point of view. I don't know if that's a ramble, but connect.
I'm going to say, Gwyn, you started training in 89, and that's when I finished my training, which is just very strange because we missed each other. And I didn't know either you or Gail until some I always remember an AGM when Sharon Bond got her first PhD. She was the first person to get a PhD from the Tavistock. Had an absolutely dreadful time, as I remember. And Peter presented, and we all sort of cheered and clapped because Sharon had done it and beaten the Tavistock. That's how it kind of felt a bit like. I came from a different position because I did a trainee social work post in Essex. Absolutely hated it. So I did the reverse as well, Gwyn, which was I was in Scotland, went to Essex as a trainee because my husband, had just married, had wanted to do a course. And he had no formal academic qualifications, and this was the only one in UK at the time, which was play leadership. So I applied and got a trainee post, absolutely loathed it. I mean, I was so disaffected by what I experienced as a trainee social worker. I have to say, I didn't go back into social work for another 14 years. As a formal social worker, I did my training on an adventure playground for children with disabilities. And it was within that sector that I stayed until I ended up just through needing to move off the North Peckham estate where we had ended up living to North London. And in North London, there were limited options at the time in North, where I was moving to, in terms of community action, local development stuff. There wasn't that much going on. Yeah, neighbouring Brent, Camden. Yeah, that was a lot of stuff going on there. Not in Barnet. And so I ended up taking a locum post. And I ended up in child psychiatry and paediatrics. really just as a sort of a random. I often think, look, when I look back, things are just so random. Sort of something happens and you end up following that direction. No particular plan to it at all. But I ended up working in child psychiatry, and the issue for me was very much that individualization on and pathologizing, which just really I found desperately challenging. But what I became aware of through the experience was my social work training and my previous experience of working with kids with disabilities just didn't meet what was needed in terms of working with families. Because it was that isolated approach to, like, the child psychotherapist would do the individual work with the child. As a social worker, you do the holding of the parent, which was, I mean, I just think it's such a flawed concept. And it still is operational in psychoanalytic circles now. And although I think there's more coming together now, perhaps than there was historically, I think there's been a lot of recognition that there needs to be a relational perspective in a way that there wasn't historically.
Yeah. I wonder what's happened to that, though, because I think it just disappears somewhere down the plug hole. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I'm sorry to sound cynical, and I'm absolutely, what you're describing sort of resonates with how I imagine, and people I've come across who've got kind of a politics about them experienced in those sort of CAM settings, for instance. But I don't know, it makes me think about Foucault's idea that judges need criminals. Sometimes I sort of think institutions need people who've got problems. And it makes me think, I worked with a family in Harlesden at one stage who social services had signed off too chaotic. She was a woman with 4 kids under 6. They couldn't work with her. She was, having too many relationships with black men. There was all these sort of pathologies about. And I used to go and work with them at home, like Carrie's talking about, what does it mean to be offside? And when I was leaving after visiting them and working with them at home one day, I dropped my car keys, and they fell down a drain. This family, it was supposed to be so disorganized and just unable. They were unbelievable. It was like watching this well-oiled machine in action. They knew how to deal with every fucking crisis in the world. So I had my keys back in like 10 minutes. I watched it. It just all kind of, and it just was such a little picture for me of what gets lost sometimes in those sort of, dislocated and dislocating
ways. It's also about whose value system is being perpetuated.
Yeah.
Whose labels do we believe in, and whose labels get funded? And I just thought, just to tell you how I got into KCC, I did a project in Milton Keynes with women across the housing estates. They were isolated, as I told you, and there was a cable TV station in the city which put programs down the cable into people's houses. So and it was community access. And I invited women on the estates to make TV programs if they wanted to for each other. And I played back a set of programs that they made in the back of my car when people came out of the school gates. So other mums joined in, and it was a very interesting project. It lasted, I was there for a year, and it lasted 2 or 3 years. Now, during that process, the important thing for me was that we made these programs, but the women did the editing, and they had editorial control. So I carried editing equipment into their kitchens at night because they couldn't get babysitters and so on. And of course, this was this model of small groups of women, and the kind of conversations they had about themselves and their lives and their relationships. And I felt I felt alongside, and it was very simple, really. I wanted to know how to ask different questions, or I wanted to get some kind of template in my brain that could make me be more helpful in that situation, or respond in a way that would maybe make it have a different kind of effect. And this went on in my head for about a year or 2 years, and that's what led me to look for a therapeutic training. And my experience was very similar to how Gwyn described. I could not deal with anything psychodynamic, or but I'd now spent years of working with people and enabling things to happen between each other. I'd done a lot of community action, community projects, and inviting people to tell each other their stories. So it wasn't an internal process, didn't fit for me at all. And I went to a lecture, I think it was John Bing Hall somewhere, and he talked about systems, and that made sense to me. I applied to the TAVI, and they didn't ask me one question about my life. I mean, I was in my 40s when I went there. I went to KCC, and it was Peter and I don't know who else, but we spent an hour and a half because they were very interested in descriptions of community work and community action, and they explored for me to make sure that there was a fit in how they were thinking and what and the rest is history. I mean, that's how I got there. But I also needed, it was because I needed to think, I needed to find I needed to help in thinking, and I also needed help to define myself as something. And I'm not sure I did the second thing, but it shifted and it changed. And of course, after that, I spent quite a lot of time in the NHS, and also did a lot of community projects.
Because you raised that question about how did you manage that transition into the NHS, Carrie, and I'm interested in how you found that.
Well, I went into the NHS in Sheffield, into Sheffield CAMS, which were the best years of my working life, really, and I've with such a cooperative, respectful team. I mean, respectful to the clients and how they thought about the clients and talked about them. And it was so new to me. I hadn't worked with people in the mainstream health before, and it was very exciting to me. And we did a lot of work. It was before there were cuts, and we often worked as a team with families. And with groups, and so I was always working with somebody from another discipline, and of course it was magical for me, finding out how different people thought and worked with problems, and how they defined and the people who pathologized and what was going on, and how I had to manage to work around that pathologizing, to work in a different way. But the experience of Sheffield was brilliant. The experience in Brent was more complex, but I'd started doing specific work with mothers and babies, again using video. And so in the end, I kind of I carved out, or they carved out, just that area for me to work in. So it was positive. That the 10 years were the most amazing years, really.
So the constraints that Gwyn described, because I mean, I think that idea, Gwyn, of, the constraints that institutionalized working contexts place upon their staff at times. I mean, my sense is there was more opportunity to challenge that. And I think it is more difficult. My sense now of those people who are still working in the NHS is that it's more difficult because it's so top-down managerialism. It's very difficult to challenge. Whereas I kind of suppose I always kind of felt my first, I mean, I suppose I was still training when I was coordinating an intensive therapeutic play group in child psychiatry for children under 5, and that was for families and children, and any siblings when there were holidays came to that as well. And I look at the resources that that took now and just think, well, it will never happen again, because we were a very intensive team of health visitor, speech and language therapists, pediatric occupational therapist, pediatric physiotherapist. And it was, as you say, Carrie, in my experience then, it was an opportunity to really hold together and have different perspectives appreciated. But that shift occurred, I think, particularly during the 90s, where, I mean, I went to another agency where it was almost decried to call something multidisciplinary. And what happened then was a particular profession sort of got a dominance in terms of their view was the only view. And how you then, as sort of a wider collective of alternative voices to a psychiatrically driven voice, which again, I would go back to the question I think when asked at some level. I mean, my view of the idea of diagnoses is that it's just big pharma driven. The whole thing is big pharma. It's all about capitalism.
Yes.
I think it's changed, though. I think it's changed.
In what way?
Well, I think that historically, diagnosis has definitely, as you say, Jill, been something that has kind of been a project to kind of exercise power over others in terms of offering them an identity that is impoverishing and in a way rendering them powerless or more without a sense of power. I think it's changed in I'd say the last 15, 20 years. I work much more with people who are self-diagnosing, for whom they understand, young people understand, partly they're offered these sort of diagnoses or descriptions of themselves. But actually, I think they also I think things like autism and ADHD, now they kind of are ways sometimes of convening communities of experience rather than someone else imposing a story.
Yeah, I would agree.
I've got some respect for that, and I think it's worth working with it. And I think, it's a sign of the times. So I think I've gotten much more nuanced about what does it mean, because I've also found sometimes, there's no doubt you have, sometimes if you really want to unsettle people's stories of diagnosis, some people, they don't like it, they don't want it, it's what they feel they've chosen and they're sticking with it. Somehow it's got benefits that need to be respected that we don't always understand. But I think now, in the main, diagnoses are things people feel they have the power to bestow upon themselves, and they understand there's a relationship between those descriptions and resources.
Absolutely. That's the troubling issue, isn't it? Because if you're trying to get a formal diagnosis now and you've got a waiting list, and it will mean a difference in relation to how much support you have in a classroom environment.
Yeah.
Or whether, you can get support in further education in terms of additional hours, etc. I mean, people are waiting for so long. So yes, I think you're right in terms of I think it's delightful to see how descriptions now of autism spectrum are very, very different. So it's a positive description in a way. It's a non-pathologizing, and it's the same with ADHD. And certainly that connected for me with the descriptions that the parents that were part of my research would give in relation to their young people who had had the diagnosis. And that dilemma around diagnosis or not diagnosis, what does it mean? I mean, I still feel that there's a massive push because of the power elites around this, that, you know, pharmaceutical industry is the biggest around worldwide, globally, and it has so many vested interests. So I still feel.
But I think things like autism and ADHD are a site for political action as well. So although I think there are inevitably large pharma interests and diagnoses developed in order to service those interests, I also think that there are big political, there is both a convening of, you know, there isn't the same, what it means, what community means now is entirely different to what it's meant to us. We're all where we are in our age and what we've been through. It's entirely different now. And I think that that kind of where and how is community convened is very different now. And I think sometimes it is through those kind of diagnoses, self-diagnoses. And in a way, I don't have so much of a problem with that, if indeed it leads to people being engaged with deciding for themselves and with one another what it means to say that they're that and what they need in order to have that resourced. It's just, I just think it's a different kind of vocabulary for life now, probably. I don't know. What are you thinking, Gary?
I'm thinking about the meaning of the word community and the community of diagnosis, which is in a way what you're talking about, and I was thinking about the role of de-expertizing those of us who are working in these situations, and you know, I don't know. I mean, I've been out of the field, but situations like when you know, when the adolescent came into CAMS because of huge behavioural problems in school, and you invited 2 or 3 friends from school to come into the session and to talk about what he was like out of the class, to create an alternative story, and to help him build that story in a different way of thinking about himself. And that's what I was thinking about when you said community, those kind of examples, and how I felt they were essential to the practice, whether it was in CAMS or whether it was on the streets in Camden or wherever. And what's happened to those possibilities now? I mean, and how far those kind of interventions, how far they're now talked about in training or in, you know, when groups of professionals get together.
Or not.
Or not. Or because everything, or has everything become so fraught and so organized by pathology that it's very difficult to open the lens.
I wonder how those things are documented as well. You know, all of the things probably the 3 of us have experienced, being part of, witnessed to, etc. I sort of think, you know, what more recently there's been lots of sort of requests to be part of various archives, like the bus company. Someone got in touch and said, you know, do you want to be, we're creating this archive.
Yes.
And like with the big practice, you know, we were 30 years and someone said, well, you should be creating. So we are sort of a kind of history, but I was thinking, in a way, apart from within us, some of these histories in a way probably are not visible. I don't know. That's not something I'm going to put probably very much time into, but I do think what happens when these kinds of stories are not available, or and probably people obviously are making their own stories, but I think it's a pity sometimes not to have more opportunity to hear these things. And
yes, there are. I mean, there are movements. I'd be very interested in the systemic therapy field and in the KCC alumni field, what is there in terms of archives and recording of history and uh, I mean, I know that in the narrative movement, they have regular conferences and regular opportunities to share information and to share stories. But the other question is, how far is it useful, you know, for three old alumni like us to be talking about the experience and the clarity of what went on when those resources are no longer available. I mean, I'm transferring it now to thinking about community work and thinking I've been writing some stuff about work I did in the early 70s in Leeds, but where are the public spaces now? I mean, there are no bomb sites to run play projects with kids, and there's less and less open space, and there's more and more health and safety. But it's very easy for people in our situation, as you say, age and so on, to be critical of that. But the monetizing, you know, play spaces now are indoor spaces which you pay quite a lot of money to take your kids in for the day. I mean, dog walking spaces, you have to pay a $5 to take your dog in to walk. And everything's become everything's become monetized in terms of what you can afford and what you can't afford. But then haven't our lives become that as well? Isn't, you know, a career in the NHS, isn't that part of the same thing? Of wanting to be a level D or a level B because we all need, I mean, our society has turned into
what Margaret Thatcher said, a community of individuals somehow, a group of individuals rather than communities don't exist. I mean, individuals are an earner. The story of the individual is huge.
Yes.
When you look at those the rise of advertising in the States, it's all about the development of stories of self. So in a way, this is one of why I went into working with individuals systemically, to unsettle all of that stuff. You know, it's pernicious in a way. It leads to...
Absolutely. But also, I wanted to just bring this into the conversation.
Inequalities in health. Go on.
Yeah.
Well, and you mentioning Thatcher, I mean, Thatcher embargoed this. And if it wasn't until he came to Wolverhampton to speak, Public Health invited him before he died, and he talked about warehouses full of this report that Thatcher refused, absolutely refused to allow to be published. And I think that says it all pretty much, because I mean, those inequalities, the inequalities that we know still exist. And they're, I think, as you say, Carrie, you know, they're even more sort of bare in many ways, because if you can't afford to pay it, you get bloody nothing nowadays, you know, and you get no health treatment anymore either. So without sort of, you know, sort of ending kind of on a kind of rather negative note, I mean, I think what needs to happen is that people have really got to kind of recognize again that power does come from community, that communities have the most extraordinary ability to challenge the purse holders. And it's interesting when you say, Gwyn, about working individually, because, yeah, I guess that's a very, you know, it's a very important way of also challenging the idea that as individuals we can't do anything. And I think that's often what you know, the younger generation is now often faced with in the face of like sort of the digital world. You know, what can you do to make the difference?
That's silence.
No, I was just thinking, Jill's talking about, this is sort of a winding up thing. And I was sort of thinking, I was just thinking about my sense of the overall conversation. And I'm sort of wondering how it will look and sound. Not in a kind of, I'm worried about it way, in a curious way, really. And I was thinking there's probably many more conversations could be had, couldn't there?
Yes, I think that this, partly because of the disruptions at the beginning, but I think I'm just beginning to think about some of the things that you've brought up, and also relating them to past experiences, because we've been quite general in talking about the things we did and how we got to systemic therapy, but actually we all must have very specific stories of our own interventions and how we were affected by other people's interventions. Like I was thinking while you were talking, I was thinking that in my early days of street theatre, we created plays for people. They were participatory, but they were for people. And it took me probably 15 years before I realized what was important was those people creating their plays or their stories or their poems or their whatever it is about themselves. It's a lot more interesting than me inventing a story about dinosaurs or something. And that was a huge turn in my head. It's one of 2 or 3 turns that led me to the systemic training. But I thought that, and then I invited a community. I thought about, ages of transition. And I took the age of 16 and called the project On This Housing Estate, Sweet 16. And kids of 16 interviewed anybody who was older about their memories. And that led to, that was actually, it's like, sometimes you think just, what is the question? Or you get a question that makes a difference in a session. That was the only thing that I needed to say. Didn't matter what else happened. Those people sat of all ages, aged from 70 to 16, in their living rooms, talking about everything you would want people to talk about and give each other support and reflect on. And that kind of, why have I said all that? That kind of community intervention, setting up the triggers and the structure, with no funding and not in people's, not in a fancy building, in people's living room with a cup of tea, and exchanging real stories. And I think that's, I don't want to be nostalgic about then and now, but it feels like it feels incredibly difficult, perhaps, to create that now, to create the ease of people moving in and out of each other's stories and each other's living rooms.
It's interesting because I end up still being skeptical about some of the kind of stuff that went on in the 70s, because it was still state intervention.
In what way?
In people's lives. The fact that,
how do you mean state intervention?
Because there was a relationship in terms of, and I think the idea of the shift from social democratic model of public welfare to a neoliberal model of private welfare is a huge issue for all of us now. But I think about, a job I had was in Lambeth to set up a project for children with disabilities. Now I know the only reason they put funding into that post was because there were a couple of other projects for children with disabilities that had suffered terrible vandalism. So the thinking behind funding a community development worker was only to try and ensure that the local community didn't react against children with disabilities being bussed in with the Inner London Education Authority, because that's what the projects were. And so I do still have a cynical take in terms of what was going on in the 70s. And I think maybe that's, for me, a useful way of thinking about the future.
You know, I also think, though, that in the kind of reality that we live with and in, as well as the one we're wanting to shape, there are always, and probably always have been, certain criteria for funding that one has to sometimes kind of, I mean, I think this speaks quite a lot to what happened in the early 2000s in London as well, where voluntary sectors were some, people who were providing things outside of institutions were forced into a competitive state where they had to vie with one another for funding, and then, slipped over the edge because they were given all the statutory requirement responsibilities that they wanted to shed. But I think there's what the funding is intended to do, and then there's what you do with it anyway. I mean, I just, and I understand that there are limits to that, but I actually think sometimes, and I speak as someone who hasn't had to seek that kind of funding, we have always been scrupulous at the practice about, once you start getting into requiring funding, it definitely does affect your freedoms to develop your practice. But I think maybe sometimes things have to happen outside of what they want, what the brief is intended to be, because like Carrie's saying, there's sort of a relational process that goes on that is more powerful than the number crunching and the statistic outcomes that people want. One has to somehow hold on to that possibility wherever it happens, no matter how small. I think those things make a difference. They make a difference to people's lives. And I think that's part of, systemic practice has made a difference to my life, and I hope in some small way to people I've come across in my work. I think that's pretty important, isn't it?